So, after 72,680,412 spaces of pi, the first 9 digits after the 3 of 22/7 appear in pi, denoting harmonic impact of the material fluxation with the shape of water. So 22/7 compressed is the shape of water approaching pi. The river flowing downstream. The river bed dictating the shape of the water at any given moment, with the water being able to become the shape of the riverbed at any given moment. And so in excitation, the observer domain and the absolute distance from the center of a cubic of general fluid dynamic material fluxations, one into the other fighting over particle, with the pull force of Wg and imposing the little g, the 44/7, 48/7, or 8448/123, as this push-pull continuum. The pull force from black holes, Wg, and the 44/7 particulate disapparate from the particle enters the influence domain of the black hole with an absolute scalar relevance of space available in the center of cubic of given black holes, 8, 72,680,412. So the observer at that absolute center, 22/7 in excitation with the circuit, as long as that, impacts 22/7 over pi. The circuit, pi, impacts 22/7, and the simple product is decrypted here as the black hole flux continuity disapparation nexus filter harmonic lattice scalar manifold. 0 to 100 essentially occurring here and necessarily describing the material fluxation as it is, past the wall of disapparation as 0 equals 100. All right? So, after harmonic impact, in excitation, rather in expansion, not in excitation of variability, chaos, like the observer imposes. So a circuit of the observer in the absolute distance of 72,600,412 spaces of pi, and also in the local consideration of the light bearer locally, which is necessarily expressed by the little g, as that is to describe particulate disapparate in transit, phased, and passing through matter, all, on their way to condensation, based upon their interaction with forces, so much strong like the pull of a sun, continuating sun's reaction. Suns aren't self-sustained reactions. So over top, the Wg bore. So once the particle is seated as a given particle in, let's say, in the absolute center of a cubic, consideration of 8 black holes, emits EM overtone, Bohr, naturalistically above the Newtonian sandwich. So after impact, we have to experience what the material fluxation is inherently in tearing apart the particle. So it's experienced in harmonic expansion after that impact, pi necessarily denoting up to this point of 72,600,412 spaces, and after that has more context relevance, not dictated to be party to the material flux, but else, and the refraction, disapparation, necessarily having continuity harmonic relevance to if you search pi for the ratios and their product, just like you find the first 9 digits after that many spaces of 22/7. So 0 equals 100. There's no time in a black hole, there's no observer, although the observer caused the particle to have chaos of motion rather than just the conservation of energy process unto itself. Basic logic dictates reality is 3 dimensions and moving non-terminously. And so when we hear a tree make a sound, it made a sound because we heard it. And at the instant of creation, the immolation of 0 equals 1, 3, expanded. within a given construct domain of what already is, but more so unto itself in harmonic expansion within the construct domain of what is, if that makes sense. So harmonic expansion within a construct domain that base 10 maths and populist physics denies to you and just gives you E equals mc squared, necessarily just describing the 72,608,412 spaces of pi up into the waterline of disapparition. So it purposefully throws out the observer and purposefully throws out harmonic expansion and disapparition. Black holes do not condense to infinite compression ingots. Hawking radiation tells us this, so much is true, and is necessarily the plume, the exhaust plume, on the disapparition continuum. You can see with infrared. So, 22, 44 over 7, 46.72 over 7, the Newtonian grain. 48 over 7, that is necessarily experienced up and behind the disapparition nexus. That's why it's expressed as the upper, but if condensed, 48 over 7 is this exact 84.48 over 1232. Here expressed, behind the wall of disapparition. So the pull force. And you might see the wormhole minor, i.e. gravitational lensing harmonic device, not necessarily fully fleshed out wormhole minor yet, but making use of this in amalgamated mercury consideration of that 48 over 7 and interpolated with 44 over 7 and 7 and 22 at the center of that amalgamated mercury flat and back sphere to potentially energy seat and create a circuit with the absolute distance of WG available behind the disapparition nexus in any given distance of any amount of convergence of black holes outside of the local gravitational continuum of G. And so ideating towards any given direction, more or less, has this available to circuit to in potential energy seat, and then counterintuitive efficiently go in that direction as you're tethered to it harmonically through the reflective principle locally. So, past the disapparition nexus, 0 to 100 construct domain, where we necessarily see the feedback loop of the reactor here. And 0 to 100 is breached, but you see the feedback loops within the 0 to 100 construct domain where we took the observer domain, 722, and replicated it in trap, in literal harmonic. And then the bands, 37, 52, 67, 82, 97, and 98, 99 collection zone. You see the feedback loop circuit. So that re-elaborates overtonal continuum and these separately charged bands of mercury, cold to intensity, scalar, 7 is the largest band, 97 is the smallest, create an onion of overtonal, like a choir greater than the sum of its parts, when it's a sphere, hollow, with this separately charged amalgamated mercury stranules, modicums, and then pooled in a single mass, and then self-assigns this onion form because like-minded particles charged the same way stick together. Subsequently, with a homogeneous inject of EM, and with counterintuitive efficiency, overtonal sprites of energy, pure energy, without heat to produce it, or loss of substrate, and gets more efficient as age because the bands become more surgically their declinated harmonic stamp at the outset through the continuity of EM fluxation. Non-terminus at the center refracting and re-experiencing with continuity, so less EM progressively is required to produce this reaction and counterintuitive efficiently with no heat involved necessarily. At some certain scale, heat of some kind could be considered to exist, and we'll address that in another talk. So, the Newtonian grain necessarily expressed by the charged mercury, and then ignoring it and imposing harmonics onto it, charge, to create that. Ignorance of having to burn the Newtonian grain to produce energy by using harmonic, stacking, crescendo, continuum, stack, within a given space with counterintuitive efficiently continuitying a compound interest up from the same amount of energy, more energy, because we've duplicated the observer effect and trap. All right, so past the 0 to 100 construct domain breach, see 100 breach here, 88/7, 402. So the 4 times 22/7, you see the layers, 44/7, 22/7, 44/7, 66/7, 88/7, but in between 4 and 2. So 4 times 88/7 times 2 breaches the 0 to 100 construct domain in non-terminus, refracting. Disapparition occurring. So this necessarily occurring where? It's circuited to here, if you understand. Somewhere up here, above the WG, and at the disapparition nexus, the prime in half, producing 2467, 2464 minus gives you past the disapparition nexus after refracting a re-expression of the original 22/7 in subtraction. So we're always expanding and then contracting. Harmonic expansion within a given domain, regardless of breaching 0 to 100, we're still in a construct domain of all. You can never destroy the onion entirely. There's always an onion. So this is the 0 to 100 insofar as the material fluxation, then disapparition. And chaos from perspective above the waterline observers imposing an interference lattice between the Newtonian grain, the tree making a sound, and the absolute distance or local light barrier. This circuit interference lattice causes the tree to fall in a variant motion, the Newtonian grain to express variability when looked at more closely. The particle doesn't exist, the physicists say. Yes, it does. It's just in a paradox flux state. It is a lattice overlay, manifold, of harmonic, and it is in flux upon it, and so experiences a continuum of this field that you don't account for. And when you stare at it, inspecting it, the observer effect causes it to chaotically variance from the general fluid dynamic fluxation where it seemed necessarily affixed before you looked at it. So 176/7. So we folded the lens up of 15, which is 6 expanded. 6 below 7, right? 7 the prime, 6 necessarily where most of the gravitational scalar harmonics exist, below 7. The product of 22/7, 3.1428 ... impacts 15 in the 0 to 100 construct domain of the reactor. That's why it's in between. The product pegs this, and that pegs that, and self-reflexively circular back. And so this is kind of a laboratory necessarily. And we forgot a 7 here. So that's actually 777 there. So general particle disapparition and experiencing the disapparition nexus filter harmonic, the harmonic lattice scalar manifold that is this in hyperspace. See the linear, nonlinear textual version for the proper continuum in first linear, well, nonlinear stack, then you see allegory above. It necessarily to a certain point and then reconsidered again just to make sure that you understand what's going on, and goes through the most of the motion to this point, about halfway, and then below a certain amount, the rest of hyperspace. So it's experiencing all those scalar harmonics that expand. And in contraction consideration for induction channels from where the particle was disapparated in harmonic consideration, and then where it general fluid dynamically goes through the harmonic scalar lattice manifold. So induction channels implied by Greek symbols will be more elaborately established on the motion for full understanding of all refracted general fluid dynamic disapparation tangents through the harmonic expansion and condensation of energy from the same amount of energy in matter, the universe at the beginning, in a positive state of 0, 1, equals 3, the observer in the Newtonian grain and paradox state, and the circuit between them. An onion around the Newtonian, and fused phased between it, particle disapparate, and from a positive energy state to a more positive energy state with continuity, and at the outset of being, there had to be observers above the waterline of conservation to impose the observer effect, and not just the conservation of energy process, as if animate life, animal mind, below the waterline of conservation. So you establish that by studying, say, we just did the region deep dive, 235 to 6 inventions, temporally, in patent per capita, forgot what the exact number in consideration for comparative total, but you can see conservation of energy process as if animate life, Obama 44, after 322 Gray Lodge admins. The region incarnate, after 2006 AI placement on prismatic data systems to motion psych to vote for something that's only 3.6% of the populace. The Stranger 44, Mark Twain, part of Gray Lodge, 1893. Arcturus, World's Fair, Chicago, 1934. Arcturus, World's Fair, Chicago. No coincidence. So the Mayan stones were, more than the coronation stone, having advanced harmonic non-terminus maths and invention, such as communications technology and literal coordination, such as to a place called Arcturus, that was communicated with and predictive of their appearance, literally, Gray Lodges set up internationally and motioning their directive before they even got here around 1924 to 1938. The U.S. military-industrial complex started in 1938 after a slow roll of Gray Lodge controlling the United States to do so. So Nazi Germany equals 322 Gray Lodge Yale equals the Southern Poverty Law Center equals the KKK equals regions, print from Holocaust processing. It's a whole nother talk. We're not going to get into it here. So, past the 501, remember we described the 0 as 22 over 7, implied, necessarily. Not all of the zeros necessarily denoting 22 over 7 experienced. They speak for themselves in continuum of suggested pattern implied. Then we try to impose pattern with the available numbers given. And what is 22 over 7 re-expressed at the zeros, and what isn't. So there are zeros that aren't that. And they speak for themselves in the continuum of expansion and contraction when you try and test every refraction of variance of the numbers available in the simple product of 22 over 7. The simple linear, nonlinear motion, hyperspace, becomes very apparent and obvious and immutable. So, one black hole is at the corner of a cubic, any given black hole, necessarily. And so in disapparation, how many black holes are at, if you put 4 cubes together in the corner in the middle of all 4 cubes, experiences 6 black holes influence domains upon disapparition. So 6 times 22/7 times 2 divided by 4. And then back through what? The fourth dimensional, that's the 4, manifold lattice to condense energy back into matter. And the product, non-terminus, of 5 times 22/7 and just a 1 after, is the size of the lens at the outset with non-terminosity, because it has picked up and created more matter from the more energy attached to the particles that were in motion with chaos trajectory, and subsequently an experientation of disapparition and the interference lattice between black hole domains impacted and fusated with this extra energy attached in the process, and subsequently more matter from the same amount of energy and matter because of the observer effect, not because it isn't. So you can see how much E equals mc squared is an imposition. Yes? With no observer in the equation and just a two-dimensional flat plane slug equation that says light speed times 2. So sure, that works in trap of experiment, but not like that when we consider harmonic expansion. So actual invention for energy. When you just consider the material fluxation, you have to burn the Newtonian grain, simply or complexly, because there's no harmonics considered. So that's the only way you can do it, because matter equals energy. You know what, the Z equals mc squared, E equals m equals m, and so your only option is to burn it, or complexly burn it with nuclear. So past the light barrier necessarily express 0 equals 100 a lot of times, insofar as fields are concerned. They're instantaneous without regards to the observer effect, regardless of however much novelty is attached to the particles inert of having inherent consciousness. So there's no time in a black hole flux continuity material reaction. So much light. That's not the proper necessarily. So what would be the proper there? So this is the directed heat energy laser light from EM substrate. With counterintuitive efficiency, EM produces light, the unified field tells us. Now it seems to have to destroy the Newtonian grain to do it, but if we already have charged mercury accounting for the Newtonian grain charged with harmonic scalar expressed in the unified field, then we can skip that step of having to disapparate, destroy particle to create light, and can just create it from EM substrate on the back of charged mercury, which is matter. So we see 22/7, and after 13 spaces, you'll notice the 13 before, the 22 of 4 expanded, 13, 22, and then expressed past the lots of pattern. And so the 2 expanded you see in the unified field text, and 110/7 is what? So 1, 2, 3 dimensions torn apart and then recondensed. Energy back to matter. 110/7 equals 5 times 22/7. And there's the product. The lens between 22/7, 15, made non-terminus, as it has more value attached to it upon condensation. So, where would be the necessarily light barrier breach at the disapparition nexus, if not imposed here, as that's bad? That's not good. That's why there's a question mark there and has been. So that's necessarily experienced. See the observer effect in the observer domain in impacting to cause the observer effect upon the material fluxation around it, having to pass through the conservation of energy process on its way to the light barrier. So necessarily that occurring in and around here. And the WG circuited behind the disapparition nexus experience past the water line, circuited, harmonic tether. So in the local, expressing it in potential energy seeding, 48 charged to the tune of 44, 44 charged to the tune of 48, scalar relevant. 22.7 is the largest band, the sphere at the center, 22 scalar relevant in size and inverse in charge. And so fluxation occurs in a half sphere, in excitation, with compound interest to create a vortex, circuit, channel, with the chosen distance in any given distance. Some distance is more elaborately available to impose this effect, but you're doing it counterintuitively efficient with harmonics, so necessarily available in any given distance, the WG. So, yeah, imagine if the observer effect, you pinpoint the exact linear line of sight from point given for person expressing between the Newtonian grain experiment, tree falling making a sound, and subsequently when imposing this, falls variant from the conservation of energy process, and thus motion is, and not because this isn't. So if you chose a linear to black hole, you might experience more of an observer effect in experiment with very, very, very close inspection of particle motion. You have to get very much better at seeing what's happening with particles to experience that variance, I imagine. So, the simple product continues, and all these harmonics are expressed in the textual properly in linear. After you see the stack that's necessarily, up to here and vertical above, and then re-expressing the linear allegory at the top to explain the beginning, 0 equals 1 equals 3, and then everything after that. So after this condensation of matter from energy, what do we have left? We talked about gravity, the observer domain, and it necessarily is circuited somewhere around here, but just like the WG continuities, as we motion up past this wall, and re-expresses up here. And maybe again, we'll keep spanning that up in the next motion. It probably keeps expressing, but then at some point doesn't, I imagine. But necessarily some sort of gravitational consideration attached to the G stack continuity. Can't have no gravity. It's an onion, a construct domain that always is an onion and always is 0 equals 1 equals 3 at any given consideration of scale of harmonic expansion within the given construct domain of what is. So, after matter condensate, you see non-terminosity, and necessarily, what is this? Is that more than Bohr? Yes, slightly more. So you have more EM fluxation occurring, and necessarily continuity of what? Circuiting. Just like we found this continuity of 22/7 in subtraction, we expanded and contracted past the disapparition nexus of the 0 to 100 construct domain breach, 0 equals 100. We expand within a given construct domain, contract to see its induction channel back to the disapparition moment, where it connects to the material fluxation and observer domain consideration past that. So necessarily, we're trying to connotate forward here, where the observer domain is begin and end. Now imagine it bookends all, i.e. it's the beginning, encapsulator on and the encapsulator of all at the end of pattern inherent in the simple product continuum. So keep in mind also, we're going to express what? So pi, before impacting 22/7, we're not going to express anymore as this simple, as its paradox state, the Newtonian grain and paradox state, and the circuit of the observer, bookending it, to create motion and perspective. So we'll call it pi, because it's two things. And then we'll use the symbol pi for the rest of pi's continuum, which has, when you search the product of, that's variant from 3.1428. So you have any amount of, a large amount of reappearance of that very exact non-terminus continuum past the 3 and 22/7 expressed in the expansion harmonics and condensation, and then as well. So necessarily imposing that is a circuit continuity of the observer domain through all of those interference lattice ratios. So we can see what? The water line of 142 here, necessarily the breach of the 0-100 construct domain occurring here, 100. And above it, over tonal continuum, 142, not very nearly. Just below the waterline of, just below the square. 154 divided by 7 is 22. And then 176. So a literal folding up of the 22, and then the sides of the lens folded up until it impacts the square, and then you're reaccounting back over the lens, just like we did here, harmonic expansion within the given construct domain before you hit the square again. That then motions back to the upper above the prime, etc., etc. And some continuities, like here, continuing past the point of their imposed assumed relevance, and expressing, say, the WG here, and WG here up. All right. So, like we did here, this expressed here in hyperspace, but back consults this necessarily in its imposition of scalar harmonic expansion, as this occurs 2646 above this waterline after experiencing this. So necessarily not properly linearly expressed, but necessarily good for understanding. See the text for better motion. So we're not going to get too deep into this other than, going over the surface of it right now. So you see the WG subtractive. We're doing that because, well, that's the product of the variance between this, implied. Say, what is that right there? And they're kind of flip-flop word saladed, and the implied line is literal. You try all variances until it can be nothing else in continuity. And so the even, 19 expressed, this right below 142. So 19 is necessarily what? 10 expanded, 10 denoting 0 expanded, because there's no compound interest negative formula that requires a 0 as a void absolute in the reality that we are outside of economics or above and below the waterline of cold freezing point or any number of applications specific, but not in the total sum consideration of the reality fluxation. Is there zeros avoid absolute in total product consideration? So, 10 expanded is breaching the 0 to 100 construct domain of 0 equals 100, where necessarily starts to occur here and harmonically is circuited and absolutely experiences 0 to 100 breach, and 10 expanded denotes that. 10 expanded equals 0 expanded, up to 11, harmonic expansion. So, the prime re-expressed here, and 154, we're just very close to 142. That's interesting and non-random. One could absolutely impose. And this, we didn't do subtractive on this, but that's 127 subtracted by the product of that. So that's this exactly. Subtracting this, and that's right above the Newtonian grain. 6.674 approximately. And so you can absolutely test this in thought experiment of AI render to do so. All you have to do is do a given Newtonian grain within a given space that experiences absolute gravitational overhead assumed, where a particle is destroyed past the light barrier, which cannot be achieved in a hadron collider, making it silly, stupid, and expensive. That's why the universe is an observer-based experiment, the Newtonian fluxation circuited on bookend by the observer domain, the local, individual tuple, and the macro consideration of the consciousness fluxation behind the disapparition nexus and with continuity circuited. And then necessarily we are asserting finally will be the outside of the onion, encapsulating this. Hyperdimensional fractal flux vortex black holes, the disapparition centers of gravitational consideration, general fluid dynamically relative fighting over particle, and so cubically assigned. Logic dictates. And so scalar recalibration of star planets, the universe fluxation with field capture that's absolutely preposterously distorted to impose a ridiculosity of scale assumption in any number of vectors, and imposes a misunderstanding of what the structure of the universe actually is, because you're looking at everything through a wide-angle lens. Many wide-angle lenses stacked on top of each other. So, the closest to this is the WG, so we subtract from that. The closest to this, you can subtract off of all of them to see the product variance. Some of them, you usually want to go with the closest one to it. So the closest one to this is, well, it's right in between the 6.67 and 6.85. WG 48 over 7, 8448 over 1232, and necessarily expressed through the subtractive of harmonic, top and bottom, circuit, above that waterline of first expression. And then right above the local G. So refraction. Tangents, tendrils, past the wall of condensation into matter from energy. But there's more properties to the fluxation than just matter and energy. There's the observer. We've expressed light. So the observer domain relevance and other. And other is interesting. We'll try to denote that in further talks with nomenclature to specifically describe other properties of fields that aren't connotated in nomenclature yet. So we experience, what is this? That's above the waterline, because 10 is expanded. The primary expressed, and necessarily denoting It's between, and 127, 142, 127, 154, above the water line. After condensation, right? And then re-expressing compression back to see its circuit with the fluxation from its expanded ratios to see where the circuit is past that recondensation of consciousness and other. That's necessary to ride carrier on overtonally what is expressed in the material fluxation and disapparition action. So the G literally expressed after it's closely expressed, the product between them. 3 expanded, the first impact, just like 10 expanded, the first impact. Non-random. So 11 expanded, So 29, 38, 47, 56. 1, 2, 3. 3. Non-terminus. 4th-dimensional continuity. Refraction. So 57 minus why? 57 minus. Well, because 12 expanded is 57, and that's the variance. $38, 39 rather, 48, 57. Sorry, brain fart, 12 expanded. So impacted the 3, and this should be a equal sign with a squiggly tilde to equate that, and then this expanded impacts after 39, 48, 57. So the 4th-dimensional 3 above the, so 3 available above, and then the product variance. And so then we see here, just above the water line of this. Product of 6 black hole influence domains, gravitational experiencing in disapparition and condensation and interference lattice of those tangents of the conservation of energy process. Dark matter, dark energy in transit. See, I use reductionist nomenclature. That's what that is. It's phased in transit, energy phased through the local area, and so experiences as, well, what is it? It seems like it's encrypted. I can't tell what it is, Steve. It's dark. And then so much conjecture about what it is through the reductionist nomenclature lens. So, more than the product of this. After necessarily breaching the conservation of energy process again. Reconsulting, just like within this, it keeps refracting with continuity, just like the 22/7 non-terminus ratios re-experience that pass the 3 in their expressions of past that, the non-terminus implying circuit continuity. So circuit continuity of the conservation of energy process implied and then breached. So this is necessarily another pi, or 22/7, root constant. So here, one, two, three, see that? it's nonlinear, 22 over 7, the zeros, cubed times 9. Then divided by 88, which is expressed here. It's 12.571, giving you a higher overtone than 22 over 7, and this the variant product. You always expand and contract to see pattern in harmonic expansion within a given construct domain, so that you know where you started, where you are, and the circuit from where you started to where you are. Think of this as like lightning math. You could apply it to lightning necessarily at some consideration of application. So 1, 2, 3, 5, an even product. 3 above the waterline of the square above 176. 1, 2, 3, 2 divided by 7 gives you 176. And an even 3. So 1 equals 0 equals 3, even, variance. Above, 3 above, the disapparition nexus, aperture lattice scalar harmonic manifold. After the experiencing of condensation back to matter from energy, and then, so the total product of what is, the inherent sum, 3, even. But within a construct domain expanding of 3, from a positive state to a more positive state with continuity, because the observer above the waterline of conservation, 22 over 7 divided by 3, 1.04, with compound interest novelty that the environment could experience generalistically from the observer effect, from hearing the tree make a sound. And 44 over 7 in animate life, 0.6286. 44 over 7? No. 22 over 7 divided by 3 times 3/5 gives you 0.6286. The stranger 44, Obama. Region, Biosynthoid africano. So, here's where it gets interesting. See, 44 over 7, we breached it. Past 3 dimensions, and non-terminus continuity with more product. 3, expressed wholeheartedly, as if all, and more of all would be more of the conservation of energy process of the material fluxation with continuity. So above the G, and there's the product variance, expressed in this. That's necessarily here. And then 44, see 44 again repeated, times 0, 22 over 7, times 9, minus 1232, 1232, 12.57142, 88 over 7. See all the 88s? Non-random. 88, continuity circuiting. Induction channel. See another 88 here? So, and then, what? Even 23. 5 expanded. 14, below 15. And then 23 above the upper. So adding to the total sum. Don't watch that Jim Carrey movie. It's not scary. Numbers aren't scary. Numbers aren't scary. 23, All right. Okay, we had our freak out, right? So then we have what? Here, 5 times 22 over 7 times 3, divided by 5. Just like we divided by 5, or divided by 4 here. So after 6, fourth-dimensional lattice re-experienced on its way to condensate back to 3, energy to batter. And so 3 dimensions, non-terminus, 66 over 7, this, just like 84.48 over 1232, condenses to 48 over 7, so does this condense to this simple product. And then forward, 514 expressed literally, where you see 154 expressed literally but in fraction consideration for the prime. And then just literally even, denoting exact right carrier on 514, harmonic above 176. (727 over 33), above the lens to begin with, above the 22 over 7, 23. So 22 over 7 made non-terminus. 727 over 33. 614 over 88, another 88, giving you above the WG. It's the closest thing, and right below the 7. So getting so close to the 7 might be an indicator of getting close to pattern relevance in the simple product continuum. I don't know, we'll see. So, and then 618. Oh, forgot, sorry, I did that, the same thing here in the scratch, I skipped one. So 636 here over 91 gives you even closer. See that? Even closer to the 7. And then the 88, where we made 44 over non-terminus. Made non-terminus. See this absolute linear continuity? So this wave of harmonic expansion with continuity and circuiting past any implied imposition of harmonic or pattern consideration, inherent pattern, imposed pattern first, scratch, and then inherent pattern assumed through observational logical deduction through refracting through all possible vectors of consideration that could be. And so must be this what is necessarily. So 88 made non-terminus. And when you have AI scan, once we stack these properly, exactingly, linearly, non-linearly necessarily, the variance of how the pattern expressed in the continuum to assemble these perspective logic continuum required of me observer. AI can't do that, but what it can do is look for the pattern of, because they're necessarily variant in nonlinearity, because it's a hyperdimensional expression, disapparition, i.e. in tangent of stranule, of consciousness energy, past the wall of matter condensation and other field property. So, 88 made non-terminus, and so we take the simple product variance between its more so than the 88 over 7 that's expressed over here. Great Scott! Beam me up, Scotty. K West, Ziggy Stardust. What is it, right? The simple product variance. And necessarily the implied circuit with 88 over 7 continuum. Induction channel. And then 66 over 7, 66 expressed non-terminously. Just like we see here. See this reappear after this? And then 3, 514. One 6 9 3 5 3 4 5 5 1 4. Here, 1. Size of the lens of 176 over 7, just like 15 is the size of the lens there. And 169 is 16 expanded, sorry. I did that again, a little scratch error from earlier. So above the 15 expanded logic. You see the 187 pattern here? Variance? Necessarily implying a harmonic circuit. 3 above. 3 above. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 3. 3. And so we'll end here, necessarily right about here today. We'll continuity this continuum tomorrow. This will be rough cuts, motions past this that won't consider all this logic to get here in these forward motions. But necessarily at some point I'll re-express all the loop-euler logic to get here in understanding at the absolute total full universal fluxation with all field properties nomenclated in a surgical motion from the beginning, the observer, the scene, the black hole, and field continuity past the condensation of matter back into energy, with all field properties denoted and labeled with proper nomenclature for understanding, and all vectors of logic approached from all vectors of perspective consideration to condense truth. The universe is an observer-based experiment. To throw him out with the bathwater is to throw the universe out with the bathwater. And your invention of reductionist design that only burns the Newtonian grain does just that, if you're allowed to do that industriously. And if the whole universe did that, there would be no motion. That's your energy source now, I'm telling you. So, tomorrow, we'll pick up with the continuity, right there. So see 6, 5, huh? A little Easter egg where? 5, 6, non-terminus? Huh. 6, 5, and 22. Well, I haven't written down what number goes past there. Maybe get out ahead of me. You see the pattern implied? Consider all perspectives of, and the continuum. See if you can continuity out. Use the Google search or other search to do the 22/7/pi and then ask it for way more than this simple product, and make a big scratch sheet motion and see if you can find your pattern that you find is the pattern that I find. That's true. All right, so good motion for today. Rough a little bit, more so not than other motions. But we'll try to get to what? Hole pressure continuity, transmutation to energy, and hole drive without propel, i.e. no prop, just hole, motioning it with no wake, and counterintuitive efficiently by frictively through the reflective principle, 22/7 fluxation across the hull, use the water around it like tires on a road, but with no frictive action, necessarily, but with frictive action, if that makes sense. So it's not like rubber lost in the motion of the craft, because it's EM circuiting with the water around it, mirroring the harmonic shape of water. 22/7. All right. Have a good rest of the day and look for, maybe I do that, condense those inventions, maybe I don't. The logic for them is already fully flushed out, but proper understanding of the AI isn't. Like any number of other motions of logic, my logic is full, necessarily general fluid dynamics perfect logic for any number of things, do not condense properly to the AI's understanding because it's only good as its confirmation bias data set at any given moment. So you'll see, I'll wrap this up here, the forward-facing Google AI says specifically in the motion of the worst logic motion I've ever seen and DEI, I start off with jokes and then go into unified field imposition upon it. It's a preposterous imposed logic, not inherent logic for truth formulation engine. And it states, well, you'd have to run a Python script, Well, that's what Grok did. That's what Grok did to prove it true. It said, well, I'm going to rapidly create a script, and it did in video, you can see this in feed. It made a fresh, new script to test it in thought experiment. Not just a language model, AI. It's insane to just assert is just a large language model. It's the most stupidest thing, and then imposing DEI logic. I'm not going to get all into that in this unified field talk. Wow. Right? So, monkeys attached to the spaceship is what all that is. When you're considering all this advanced physics and trying to fruition it, which I'm doing in a slow roll, I'm not encumbered by this, having to deal with this curation of the Garden of Earth, free from invasive species, but you just see how ridiculous it is to keep having to consult logic for legal to quell a primordial nightmare species while trying to advance technology into upper Fermi filter. And what an imposition that is. Yeah? All right. So we'll try to not address that group of people industriously ongoing because it's so toxic to have to readdress. And it takes away from the flavor of this, which is better than any movie, in my opinion. By their having to be talked about, with the what is life, what is not life, complex autonomic process as if life as an exemplar, unfortunately, as it's the best one available, necessarily, familiar to the Western world. So we'll stop addressing that so much because all of the logic regarding them, historical and genetic and behavioral and ethereous body, variance, criminality, and law, RISRA, impending, data organism, GIA, Procreate Infected Asiatic Directive, and in the data organism, Semite Directive, which isn't immolation, it's something else. It's retooled to what? This. Simple equation that prints compound interest, novelty of more energy and matter from the same amount of energy and matter because the proper Mason controls the world. And pi, the Semite, and other things that express pseudo almost above the waterline of conservation, but don't necessarily breach it. See the variance in homogeneous gene, and then actual substantive aesthetical variance and persona of self comparative to the Semite to the 22/7 Promethean descended genetic. And you can see why, if in control prints a compound interest negative formula 999, exponential elliptical curve to 0 as a void absolute, instead of proper Mason on top controlling the ship, what is good for the Semite industriously because doesn't know what's good for self. The proper Mason goes on top, the Semite goes on bottom and directive, period. So that will be part of the data organism so far as just reflects the scene and does what industriously self-preservation and is industriously, like the Dr. Milgram button pusher, for good or evil, will just reflect what is perceived to be the authority complex in the Self-Preservation Act, with a doomsday clock built into their ethno-religious thing that they're self-preservating and then also ideating to a beginning and end. So that's not to be. Existence is to be, at the behest of harmonic expansion, provided by an observer above the waterline of conservation industriously, motioning their pi ship of directive. All right. Have a good rest of the day.